In North Africa, there were no forests to hide an army, no cities to swallow a retreat, only a hard horizon and a sun that punished everything it touched. A commander could lose a battle without losing a single firefight, simply by misreading distance, fuel, water, or time. That is why the war before El Alamein mattered so much, because long before the first major assault plans were finalized, Erwin Rommel and Bernard Montgomery were already fighting a quieter battle, one of nerves, reconnaissance, deception, and tempo, where a single false assumption could decide the outcome weeks later. Montgomery arrived to command the British Eighth Army in August 1942 with a promise to restore confidence, discipline, and control. Rommel, exhausted but dangerous, carried the momentum of earlier victories and the desperation of a supply line stretched across the Mediterranean and the desert. The common myth is simple: Rommel the bold gambler, Montgomery the careful builder. But the truth is sharper. Rommel's greatest edge before El Alamein was not just daring. It was his ability to force an opponent to react on his timetable, to reveal intentions, and to spend resources before the decisive battle even began. So the question is not merely who had the better tanks or numbers. It is this: how did Rommel, before El Alamein, make Montgomery show his cards first? Two commanders enter the same sand, seeing two different wars. By the time Bernard Montgomery took command of the British Eighth Army on 13th August 1942, the desert campaign already felt like a long chase that had burned through generals and confidence. Tobruk had fallen in June, the British had been driven back to Egypt, and the fighting had ground to a halt at the El Alamein line, about 40 miles wide, pinned between the Mediterranean and the Qattara Depression, where manoeuvre room simply died. Montgomery stepped into that geography like a builder arriving at a collapsing bridge. He preached order, refused talk of retreat, and treated morale as a weapon, insisting the army would fight where it stood and only attack when it could do so with overwhelming preparation. Erwin Rommel arrived at the same line with a different problem: momentum without breathing room, because every mile forward stretched his supply chain farther back toward ports and convoys that were being hammered at sea and in the air. Rommel's gift was speed of thought and exploitation. He had repeatedly turned British uncertainty into sudden breakthroughs, using reconnaissance, feints, and aggressive forward command to make opponents feel late even when they were early. Montgomery, by contrast, aimed to remove late from the vocabulary entirely, tightening command, fixing positions, and forcing the battlefield to become predictable. And yet before El Alamein, it was Rommel who kept trying to right the tempo, probing, threatening, and shaping what Montgomery had to guard, because in the desert, the commander who dictates the next question often controls the next answer. After Gazala, why the British were running and why Rommel was gambling. To understand how Rommel could outthink Montgomery before El Alamein, you have to start with the psychological wreckage left by Gazala and Tobruk, because those battles didn't just change the front line, they changed what each side believed was possible. In late May and June 1942, Rommel's Afrika Korps and Italian formations struck at the Gazala line with a plan that looked reckless, but was built on a familiar rhythm. Wide movement through the desert, a hard punch at weak seams, then relentless pressure that convinced British commanders they were always a step behind. When Tobruk fell on 21st June, the shock was strategic and moral at the same time. An Allied fortress, a symbol, taken quickly enough to feel like a collapse rather than a defeat, and the British retreat toward Egypt became less a controlled withdrawal than a race to avoid encirclement. Rommel fed on that fear, pushing forward even as his logistics strained, because he understood a desert truth. A retreating army burns fuel, breaks formations, and becomes vulnerable to the next sudden hook around its flank. But Rommel was also gambling against math. His supply line stretched back across Libya, his forces were tired, and every mile forward made him more dependent on convoys that could be sunk before they ever reached port. By early July, the chase slammed into geography at El Alamein, where the Qattara Depression blocked the southern escape route and narrowed the war into a corridor. The British, under Auchinleck's direct handling before Montgomery arrived, held the line in desperate fighting that stopped Rommel's immediate momentum. And that is the point. Rommel didn't need to win in July. He needed the British to keep thinking like men who had just lost, because that mindset would shape what Montgomery inherited, what he feared, and what Rommel could manipulate next. Mercer Matruh to the bottleneck. How the map itself traps an army. The desert campaign often looks like pure maneuver on an empty board, but by mid-1942 the board had edges, and Rommel understood exactly how to use them. Because between Mercer Matruh and El Alamein, the terrain and infrastructure forced decisions that were as binding as any trench line. The British retreat had been shaped by two realities: the coastal road and rail line that kept an army alive, and the open southern desert that could turn a withdrawal into a flanking disaster if enemy armour cut behind it. Rommel's pattern, perfected across earlier battles, was to threaten that southern space so aggressively that British commanders began to see every pause as the prelude to encirclement. Even when they had numbers, they felt outmanoeuvred in advance. But once the fighting reached the El Alamein position, the rules changed. The Mediterranean held the north like a wall, and the Qattara Depression, a vast area of salt marshes and broken ground, sealed the south, meaning the battlefield became a narrow corridor where the classic wide desert sweep was largely impossible. That should have been the moment Rommel's style died, yet it became the moment he sharpened it, because the corridor forced Montgomery to concentrate, to predict where the next blow might fall, and to defend key ground that could not be bypassed. Rommel's probes and threats now carried extra weight, not because they were larger, but because the space to absorb them was smaller. Any local penetration could threaten the entire line. Montgomery's instinct was to turn this map into a controlled system, build depth, prepare minefields, and use the corridor to trap Rommel later. Rommel's instinct was to make Montgomery commit early, to spend strength guarding shadows, because in a bottleneck war, every tank held back to watch one possible flank is a tank not available when the real decision arrives. Alam Halfa takes shape. Montgomery builds a trap. Rommel reads it. When Montgomery looked at the El Alamein corridor in August 1942, he did not see a stage for improvisation. He saw a place to force Rommel into a bad equation, and the ridge at Alam Halfa became the hinge of that plan. Montgomery's method was simple in concept and hard in discipline. Stop reacting, start designing. He strengthened the southern sector, not to invite a chase into open desert, but to channel any German-Italian thrust onto ground where British anti-tank guns, minefields, and pre-sighted artillery could punish armour at range. Instead of spreading his forces thin in fear of being outflanked, he chose positions that could absorb a flank attempt and then counter it on his terms. This is where many narrations make Montgomery sound purely defensive, but the real intent was offensive in patience. Let Rommel commit fuel and tanks to a wide swing, let him collide with prepared killing zones, and then strike back when his spearhead was short of petrol and pinned under fire. Yet Rommel was not blind to what was happening. He had lived long enough in the desert to read an opponent's posture, and he could feel the difference between a panicked line and a prepared one, the depth, the density, the deliberate calm of units dug in for a planned battle rather than a frantic rescue. So Rommel began trying to outsmart the trap before it closed. Probing, scouting, testing where mine belts started and where the ground might still be threaded. Looking for the seam that would force Montgomery to shift reserves and reveal his real priorities. The chess match before El Alamein had now become visible. Montgomery laying the board, Rommel trying to glimpse the next move before the pieces ever collided. The Deception War, what Rommel's scouts, intercepts and instincts told him. Before tanks clashed at Alam Halfa, the real fighting happened through binoculars, radio intercepts and dust trails on the horizon, because Rommel understood that information in the desert travelled faster than armour, and could be just as decisive. His forward command style, often criticised as reckless, gave him something few commanders possessed: a near-physical sense of the battlefield, built from constant contact with reconnaissance units, patrol reports, and the rhythm of enemy movement. Rommel's scouts noticed patterns that mattered: British units digging in rather than shifting restlessly, supply dumps being carefully organised, and armour held back instead of being thrown into spoiling attacks, which told him Montgomery was not going to be baited into a premature fight. At the same time, German intelligence, though far from perfect, picked up enough signals to suggest the British expected a southern hook, and that expectation itself became something Rommel could exploit. He did not need Montgomery to be wrong. He needed him to be committed. By emphasising movement in the south, by letting dust and radio traffic hint at a wide swing, Rommel could keep British reserves tied to defending possibilities rather than preparing certainty. This was not deception in the cinematic sense of fake armies, but in the psychological sense of forcing an opponent to guard against what might happen rather than what will happen. Montgomery's strength, control, also made him predictable, because once he decided on a defensive concept, he reinforced it relentlessly. Rommel's instinct told him that even if the southern thrust failed tactically, it could succeed strategically by compelling Montgomery to reveal the depth, weight, and priorities of his defence. In that way, the desert became a conversation without words, and Rommel was trying to make Montgomery answer questions before the real exam of El Alamein ever began. The August gamble: fuel, distance, and the plan that couldn't breathe. By late August 1942, Rommel faced a decision that defined his reputation as much as his risk tolerance, because every report he received pointed to the same brutal arithmetic. His army was strong in experience but weak in petrol, his tanks were dangerous but worn, and his supply situation was not improving with time. Yet waiting favoured Montgomery, whose depots were filling, whose units were training, and whose air support was tightening its grip over the battlefield. So Rommel chose to act, not because conditions were ideal, but because delay would make them worse. His plan was to swing south around the British flank, bypass the heaviest defences, and drive toward the rear areas, forcing Montgomery to abandon his prepared positions or risk being cut off. On paper, it echoed Rommel's earlier triumphs, but this time the desert refused to cooperate. British minefields were deeper than expected, progress was slower, and fuel consumption rose with every detour and pause. What made this gamble uniquely revealing was not that it failed tactically, but that it succeeded strategically in a different way, by forcing Montgomery to respond exactly as Rommel anticipated. British reserves shifted, artillery revealed its weight, and the shape of Montgomery's defensive system became clear under pressure. Rommel could now see where the line was strongest, where it was merely adequate, and how quickly the British could concentrate firepower when threatened. Even as his own spearhead stalled and fuel ran dangerously low, Rommel extracted something priceless: confirmation. He learned that Montgomery would not be rushed, that he would not counterattack blindly, and that he was willing to let Rommel expend strength against prepared ground rather than chase him into the desert. In military terms, Rommel's August gamble did not win ground, but it won knowledge, and in the desert, knowledge could be worth more than a mile of sand. The turning point before El Alamein, when Rommel forces Montgomery to reveal his hand. Here is the turning point that often gets missed when people jump straight to the October battle. Rommel's real outsmarting before El Alamein was not a clean tactical victory, but a strategic extraction. He forced Montgomery to show what kind of commander he was under pressure and what kind of battlefield Montgomery was building. As the Alam Halfa fighting unfolded at the end of August and into early September, Montgomery refused the emotional move that Rommel had so often provoked in earlier opponents. He did not fling his armour into a chaotic pursuit, and he did not loosen the defensive net to chase a dramatic win. Instead, he held his positions, let minefields and artillery grind down the attackers, and waited for the enemy's logistics to collapse under the weight of its own ambition. For Rommel, that restraint was itself information, because it told him exactly what he could not do at El Alamein. He could not rely on panic, he could not rely on a rushed British counterattack to open gaps, and he could not rely on British command confusion to turn a setback into a rout. And yet, paradoxically, it also gave Rommel something he could use: predictability. Montgomery had chosen control over flair, system over improvisation, and once that choice was made, Rommel could map it. He could infer where Montgomery's mine belts were densest, where the British guns were massed, how quickly they could bring fire onto a thrust, and which sectors Montgomery considered non-negotiable. In effect, Rommel turned a failed offensive into a reconnaissance-in-force that exposed the architecture of the Eighth Army's defence. That is why this moment matters. Because before El Alamein, Rommel didn't have to break Montgomery. He only had to make Montgomery commit publicly to his method, so that Rommel could enter the next battle knowing the pattern he would face, even if he no longer had the resources to beat it. Montgomery. He only had to make Montgomery commit publicly to his method, so that Rommel could enter the next battle knowing the pattern he would face, even if he no longer had the resources to beat it. Why it looked like caution, but was actually control. To many observers then and now, Montgomery's behaviour before El Alamein can look like simple caution, an overly careful general who refused to gamble. Yet in the desert context, what he practised was closer to engineered control, and Rommel understood the difference, even as he tried to defeat it. Montgomery's refusal to launch reckless counterattacks was not just temperament. It was a deliberate denial strategy. Deny Rommel the kind of fluid, confused battlefield in which Rommel's speed and intuition mattered most. Every time Montgomery stayed anchored to prepared fire plans, every time he let minefields and artillery do the killing instead of chasing a headline victory, he was refusing to play Rommel's favourite game. And yet that denial carried a cost, because a controlled system is also a visible system. Patterns harden, priorities become legible, and the opponent begins to see what you value most. Rommel, even while short of fuel and battered by air attack, could now interpret Montgomery's choices. He protected the southern approach to prevent a wide hook, he massed guns to break armour at range, and he conserved his own armoured strength for a later, deliberate offensive rather than for impulsive drama. That meant Rommel could plan around what Montgomery would not do. He could expect discipline, expect depth, expect restraint. In a strange way, Rommel's last offensive effort before El Alamein forced Montgomery to prove he really meant his doctrine, and once Montgomery proved it, he became harder to surprise, but easier to predict. This is the tight paradox of high command. The same steadiness that wins battles can also broadcast a method. So when people say, Rommel outsmarted Montgomery, the truer phrasing may be that Rommel extracted the maximum intelligence from Montgomery's minimal reactions. He learned the shape of the trap by watching how calmly its jaws stayed shut. The verdict. What historians say Rommel really won before he started losing. When the dust settles on the weeks before El Alamein, the most honest verdict is unsettling. Rommel did not outsmart Montgomery by defeating him in a clean, visible way. He outsmarted him by forcing an early exchange of information, and by turning a failing offensive into a reconnaissance that clarified the coming battlefield. Many historians frame Alam Halfa as the moment Rommel's operational freedom finally collided with logistics and Allied firepower, because his army could no longer breathe without fuel and replacements. Montgomery, meanwhile, treated the same episode as proof that discipline and preparation could blunt Rommel's style and preserve strength for a later decisive blow. Both views can be true at the same time, and that is where the deeper lesson sits. Rommel won a last, subtle advantage. He confirmed Montgomery's character, tested the minefields and gun lines, and learned that the Eighth Army would not collapse into panic or chase him into empty space. Montgomery won the advantage that actually decides wars. He kept his army intact, kept his system unbroken, and let Rommel spend what he could not replace. So the story before El Alamein is not a simple tale of genius versus caution. It is a tale of two minds trying to control the tempo under different constraints, one rich in supply, one starving for it. And the desert, indifferent as ever, rewarded the commander who could turn patience into power. Because in North Africa, the opening warning remains the truth that closes the circle. One mistake is fatal. And before El Alamein, Rommel's brilliance was not enough to escape the one mistake the desert never forgives. The moment you gamble with fuel, you do not have.